Okay, welcome to the December 15th Government Relations Committee meeting. We are going to go through our general business this morning first. Mr. Clark, has the meeting been properly posted?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. And we do not have any citizens here to speak this morning, so we'll go right into our action items. We need an approval of the minutes.
I move to approve the minutes as presented.
Second?
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
And then we need an approval of our committee goals.
I'd be happy to take that, Ms. Reinacek. So just to introduce. So the last time we met in September, we talked about goals for our committee. We came up with three that we worked through. First being continuing to work on building strong relationships with our local and elected officials. Second being inviting legislators and elected officials into our schools and district on a regular basis. And the third being monitoring state and federal legislation and legislative ideas with an eye on advocating for the school district of Waukesha and state of Wisconsin. So we brought those back today for your thoughts or consideration and considered approval.
Okay, did you, board members, did you have a chance to look at those? Do you have any questions or comments on those? They seem good to you? Okay, and anything to add? Nothing? Okay.
No.
All right, then that's an action item, so do we have a motion?
Yes, I move to approve the goals for the Government Relations Committee as presented.
I will second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Okay. All right, then moving on, we have some discussion items. We have our proposed 2022 Wasb resolutions.
All right.
Mr. Seaver?
Thank you, Ms. Reinacek. So each year, the WASB, which is the Wisconsin Association of School Boards, of which we are members, puts an opportunity out for local districts to submit resolutions to them, which then go through an extensive process. And I thought we could start by watching, it's a quick 12-minute video from the WASB, because the process is somewhat unique, and I don't know that everyone completely understands how those resolutions come to pass. They ultimately inform the WASB's advocation efforts across the state with the legislative bodies. And after we watch the video, then what we can do is we can walk through. This year there are 10 proposed resolutions. Those come from local school boards, as you'll see and learn in the video. And ultimately then each district has a delegate. In our case, it's Mr. Nsba, and he will attend the State Education Convention in Milwaukee, as many of you will, and he'll be part of the Delegate Assembly, and they'll talk about that in the video as well, where he will then represent the school district of Waukesha with our vote on each of those 10 resolutions. So after we watch the video, then we'll walk through each of those 10 resolutions, kind of talk about what they mean, and decide how we would advise Mr. Nsba to vote on the district's behalf. So, any questions before we crank up the video? I think it'll be good. All right, so let's try that.
Welcome, WASB members. I'm Chris Kulo from the WASB Government Relations team, and in this webcast, I will provide a brief overview of how we decide what position to take on bills before the legislature and how your school board can influence that process. We'll go over the WASB resolution process and the role of school boards, the Policy and Resolutions Committee, the Delegate Assembly, our Board of Directors, and the WASB staff. Here's an overview of the process and the timeline. Member school boards may submit resolutions to the WASB by September 15th each year. The Policy and Resolutions Committee then reviews submitted resolutions at several meetings in October and November. The committee then determines which resolutions are advanced to the Delegate Assembly. The Delegate Assembly then votes on the resolutions, and those approved become the official position of the WASB and go in our resolution book, which is updated each year and compiles all of the resolutions adopted by delegate assemblies going back decades. The book is available on our website. Copies are also mailed to board presidents and district administrators each June as soon as the updated versions become available. A copy is also included to each delegate in their delegate packets. WASB staff plays a role but doesn't make the call. This is a member-driven process. The WASB staff does not advocate for or against submitted resolutions during this process. The role of staff is to facilitate discussion and debate, first by the Policy and Resolutions Committee, and secondly by our full membership at the Delegate Assembly. Periodically, we also review sections of the resolution book and may make suggestions for deleting outdated content. It is the WASB membership that decides the fate of each resolution. During the summer, the school board should think about, is there a pressing issue or issues, there's no limit on the number of resolution submissions a district can make, that your district is experiencing that needs to be addressed legislatively with a law change. You can review the current WASB resolution book on our website to see if or how the resolution is addressed by our current resolutions. This may lead you to want to change a resolution already in the book or create a new one to address your issue. Member school boards initiate this process by crafting board resolutions stating what you think the WASB position should be and why on any relevant topic. Your board must formally vote on and adopt the resolution at a meeting and then submit to the WASB by the September 15th deadline. WASB staff may contact you if they have questions about your resolution. It is not unusual for staff to have conversations with submitting boards to ensure we understand the resolution and the intent behind it. Once these resolution ideas are submitted, the WASB Policy and Resolutions Committee, comprised of about 25 school board members appointed each year from within each of the 15 WASB regions and from each type of school district, Common, Unified, UHS, K-8, reviews and evaluates the resolutions and determines which ones will advance to the Delegate Assembly. The committee evaluates resolutions based on 3 criteria. Is it timely? Is it worthy of debate? And does it need consideration by the full WASB membership? A common consideration as to whether a resolution meets these criteria is whether the resolution's objective is already covered by an existing resolution. So a large part of the committee's work is looking at existing resolutions on the same topic, if there are any. The committee forwards resolutions that meet the criteria, not just ones they agree with. The committee does not pronounce judgment on the merits of the resolution. That job is for the delegates at the Delegate Assembly. Ultimately, 3 things can happen. The committee may advance the resolution as submitted, advance a resolution, but suggest a modification, or not advance a submitted resolution. According to past committee members, serving on the committee is an interesting and rewarding experience where you have the opportunity to learn and discuss issues with colleagues from around the state. If you are interested in serving on this committee, please contact your WASB Regional Director. Finally, the fate of resolutions is determined by the WASB Delegate Assembly, which meets annually at the time of the State Education Convention in January. The Delegate Assembly is comprised of 1 delegate from each member school board and CISA Board of Control, as well as the 15 members of the WASB Board of Directors. A majority of these delegates constitutes a quorum. The delegates vote on the resolutions advanced by the Policy and Resolutions Committee. Delegates also have the opportunity to propose and adopt amendments to the resolutions that come before them. Resolutions are often amended on the floor of the Delegate Assembly. While the Policy and Resolutions Committee has a strong say, it doesn't necessarily have the final say. A resolution turned down by the committee is still afforded an opportunity to be brought to the Delegate Assembly floor. If 2/3 of the delegates vote in favor, the turned down resolution may be considered by delegates. A resolution may still be considered if turned down by the committee, but it must clear a higher bar. The resolutions adopted by school board member delegates at the Delegate Assembly become official positions of the WASB, are published in our resolution book, and remain in force until amended or repealed. So, your resolution is approved by the Delegate Assembly and is an official WASB position. Now what? The resolutions give the WASB Government Relations staff the direction to approach legislators to pursue new legislation proactively, and they also determine the positions we take on legislation. I'd like to show you a brief example of how we use the resolutions to evaluate legislation that is proposed in a given legislative session. 2021 Senate Bill 39 would allow a pupil who attends a virtual charter school to participate in interscholastic athletics and extracurricular activities in the pupil's resident school district. The bill would also prohibit a school district from being a member of the WIAA unless the WIAA considers the method by which educational programming was delivered, i.e. in-person versus hybrid versus virtual, during the 2020 or 2021 school year to be an extenuating circumstance that justifies transferring schools. In essence, it would have forced the WIAA to change their transfer eligibility rules. When this bill was introduced, it clearly dealt with the issue of extracurricular activities and the WIAA. We consulted the resolution book to see what resolutions we had on those topics that might apply to this proposal. First, on the topic of extracurricular activities, Resolution 3.97 very directly addresses the proposal in the legislation and was a pretty clear sign for us to oppose that provision. On the topic of the WIAA, Resolution 3.98 was relevant and again gave us clear direction to oppose that provision as well. Based on our resolutions, we oppose Senate Bill 39. While this example was relatively cut and dried, it is not always that clear. The GR staff must use their discretion about what position to take based on resolutions that do not specifically address proposals, but state more broad principles that can be applied. The most common example of this is local control and school board authority. Sometimes we do not take positions on bills if we feel we do not have sufficient direction from the resolutions. The WASB resolutions also inform our legislative agenda. Under policies adopted by the WASB Board of Directors, the GR staff determines the draft legislative agenda based on what we hear are priorities from the membership in the field and political realities in the legislature and governor's office. The draft legislative agenda contains references to the relevant WASB resolutions for each of its provisions. At its November meeting, the WASB Board of Directors adopts or approves the legislative agenda for the following calendar year. The Board of Directors may amend the draft agenda to add or subtract items or reorder them. Odd year legislative agendas typically focus on the state budget priorities because that's the first and most important bill taken up by the legislature when they begin in Januaries of odd years. It's a 2-year legislative cycle. Even year legislative agendas typically focus on non-budget legislation because by that time, the state budget has already been passed into law. So in conclusion, savvy boards can use the WASB resolution process to highlight issues or concerns to the WASB and their colleagues across the state through the Policy and Resolutions Committee and Delegate Assembly. This also allows the WASB to be a full partner with your district in advocating for your idea with legislators. This process also benefits the WASB by assuring that our policy agenda is current and relevant and reflects the concerns and priorities of WASB members. Thank you for watching this webcast. Please reach out to the Government Relations staff if you have any questions. Thank you.
So before we start walking through the resolutions, any questions on that video or the overall process that we can try to understand or help you understand?
No.
Okay, good. Well, thanks for watching it. So, Resolution 1, there are 10, and we can just walk through them relatively quickly. Mr. Clark and I tried to go through them and take some notes, and Mr. Zenobia has been through them as well. The first one is safe harbor legislation, and so it's looking at the passage of state legislation to protect youth who have been subject to child sex trafficking from criminal prosecution for prostitution. So essentially what it does is it eliminates the threat of the child or the victim being charged with, the word they use here is sometimes child victims face potential prosecution under child prostitution laws. So this, it would eliminate that for youth that are under 13. It's been successful in Minnesota, and 30 other states have done something similar to conform with the Federal Trafficking Victims Protection Act. So that's what Mr. Zenobia will either say the district supports or does not support when he's in Milwaukee on that Wednesday afternoon in January. So thoughts on that particular legislation?
Go ahead.
I think that's a great idea. I didn't even know that they were prosecuted for that. And then it also says in here that they're, the person who's keeping them enslaved to that then can't hold that over them.
Mm-hmm.
And then they're more likely to go to the stand and where does it actually say? Testify against them.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
So I'm glad this was brought forward. Anything from my committee member?
I do have a question on it.
Sure.
More generally, I guess, is what my question is, but why does the WASB bring a provision like this forward to be looked at, I guess, other than, school-age children being involved? Is there any background to why they had gotten in on this, or?
It's a very good question. We don't get exactly what district puts this forward or the rationale behind it. As we learned in the video, they must have, went through this particular book, not seen anything in there that was similar, and thought it was worth pushing forward for the entire state to consider. But that could be a really good question to even ask at the Delegate Assembly. I think it's insightful because you're right, it does impact children, but it's not necessarily an educational related issue either. I appreciate where you're coming from on it. But overall, it would appear that we would support this type of legislation, but perhaps Mr. Zenobia would want to clarify why the WASB finds this to be a matter worth advocating for.
Okay.
Yeah, I totally agree with the spirit of why it's being brought forward. And if you read down, there's a number of states that have already, I think it says 30, something similar. So, and maybe that's the rationale behind that. So I would be curious what
Yeah, it's a good question.
it was more in depth, but that was my only question.
Great. All right. So basically what we want to do through this process, Mr. Nsba, is make sure you just have enough information to go in there feeling confident. So as we go through each of them, if you have other questions, feel free. And otherwise, we'll just trust. And sometimes you go in and kind of, in my previous experience, maybe you just listen to the debate too, And sometimes some things come up, like you might think you're going to support it, and then ultimately, maybe something comes up that makes you change your mind. And I think we trust you to do that, obviously. All right, so resolution number 2 is annual inflationary or greater increases in per pupil spendable resources. So what this would do is this would tie increases in per pupil spendable resources, so the state resources that we get in the biennial budgets, and each year those would have to be tied to the rate of inflation, at least the rate of inflation, or greater. So that school districts would be able to keep up. This year's a good example. The CPI is somewhere in the 4 to 5% range. You hear economically, like if you're not getting a 6% raise based on how inflation is impacting everything else that we purchase and that we consume, you're going to fall behind. So there's those kinds of challenges are apparent in a time like this, after the CPI, as an example, had been exceptionally low for the past 5 years for the most part. So maybe Mr. Clark can talk a little bit more about that and why we think that would be something that would be beneficial, but we certainly want your perspective as well.
Yeah, under the current biennial budget, there's no increase in either. They talk about per pupil categorical aid and then increase in per pupil revenue limit authority, which I know I talk about a lot. So there's certainly a rationale if bargaining is tied to CPI with your represented group, that you tie the inflationary factor to revenue as well, but that's one person's view on that. All this comes down to a taxation issue. And the state's willingness to continue 2/3 funding or not will drive the tax issue even greater. So I think it's something based on our budget forecast, if we're just looking at us matching revenue and expenditures, it's something that we should look to approve or be part of. But it's an old issue. This one's on here every year. It's a matter of level of funding. So the taxation part would be the only question. But having no revenue increase is also extremely difficult. So I can answer any questions you have. They don't provide, tying into inflation. Well, that used to be a lot easier thing to put in there until the last 10 months or so, and it might not be but some sort of revenue limit and per pupil aid growth would certainly be beneficial.
Yes.
A question on that. It's my understanding that the legislature had said that they were not going to increase, and I don't know if it would be an inflationary increase, but really any funding due to the fact that we were getting money for the COVID response. That was part of their calculus in saying that was the rationale for not?
I can't remember if any of them said it specifically. They may have, but that's certainly a conclusion that I think anyone could draw in this budget cycle. I think this resolution is really gearing up for the next biennial budget, would be my guess, but maybe that's not true, because normally they don't go back and adjust a biennial budget once it's in place. So I'm thinking this is really for 23, 24, would that be right, I think? And then the following year, because then at that point, the federal dollars are off everyone's books, or the access to them, and it turns the focus back to state level funding for public education.
And like you said, I mean, we're already looking at an inflationary increase going into this coming year. It looks to be higher. So is this kind of go back to, I guess, maybe Act 10 and how things were changed and what could be levied against taxpayers? Is this kind of an older issue that maybe, I guess I've heard that the rate of inflation isn't necessarily keeping up with spending over the years, and I don't know how true that the authority that districts have to add additional revenue isn't always there when costs and prices obviously go up every year. Whether they go up a lot or a little, they always go up. And coming into in the next couple of years, it looks like they're going to go up more than usual. So is this, as you say, it's on there every year, is this issue kind of due to that in some part, or?
I think so, and I think it goes back even further. When revenue limits were initially put in place, the multiplier started out being tied to a CPI calculation. So there's that historic, I don't mean people are still around who remember that, but there was that tie to it. And then when taxation, mainly local property taxes, it becomes a hot political issue, usually on a 4 or 5 year cycle or whatever, became a bigger issue. That multiplier became more of a topic. And the state had budget problems. They backed off the 2/3 funding, and all these things put more pressure on the tax bill. But I do think this is the mantra that's been used, but it's always been about increasing funding of public education. This happens to be revenue limit this year, but it could be, well, on the next page is mental health and all those things. So, but there is certainly an outpacing of expenditure growth if you leave the status quo in place than what revenue is being generated. And we shared that last workshop or at the last FNF meeting. We're looking at a $3.4 million loss in revenue limit authority, which doesn't match our cost structure. I mean, you have certain things that are built in contractually. Health insurance is kind of a thing you deal with. So I think it's trying to catch up with those things. But this is always a topic, but there's different methodologies that it always leads back to the level of funding, and then that leads to taxation and all the other issues that go along with that.
Okay.
Okay. All right, let's go to number 3. 3 is funding for children with disabilities. So this is something we talked about last year. And this particular resolution is looking to increase special education categorical aid reimbursement to 60%, and also to ensure it is sum sufficient. So right now, it is roughly 30%. So 30 cents on the dollar in terms of reimbursement for special education. And because you need to have your Fund 10, which is your general fund, supplement your Fund 27, which is your special education fund, and you have to make that whole and balance that every year, we transfer, Mr. Clark, somewhere between 19 and 20 million over to Fund 27 from Fund 10 at that 30% rate. So obviously, the higher that rate goes in terms of the reimbursement, the less money that we transfer from Fund 10 to Fund 27, and the more money that we have to spend on traditional expenses and classroom learning. And sum sufficient versus, what's the opposite of that, Mr. Clark? It's some
certain.
Some certain. So currently, we're in some certain, correct? So there's only so much
Correct.
money, and when that money is gone, that's why we say it's roughly 30%, because if the money is used up, then you just don't get it anymore, so it could be like 28%. What this says is that it would be 60%, and it would be sum sufficient, so every district would get 60% reimbursement. The pot would not be set, if you will. It would have to be fluid, which obviously takes more money at the state level. So, Darren, anything you wanted to mention on it?
Yeah, the percentages, if you remember in the last biennial budget, this was a topic, and I believe the target and what it ended up being, what they talked about was like 33% is where they ended up, if I remember. But when it's not sum sufficient, it ends up being there's a set pool of money, and if the claims of eligible costs increases, the percentage actually came in around 30% because there was only so much money to go through. So some sufficient would put that guarantee on there. It'd be very easy to budget. It's very easy to identify the eligible costs. So it certainly would be an increase in overall Fund 27 revenue. So, and historically, again, the percentage used to be much higher than 30%. There was a much greater promise at one point of what it would be. But yeah, I can't argue with either one of, and it's an area of growing need, tied directly to, services to children. So I would see no reason to not support that. It would, at a minimum, just the methodology from some certain to some sufficient would provide some stability in what we know what we'd be getting. So.
Any questions?
I guess one clarification I would have in that then is some of the funding that we have already here, that the problem is that we're not allowed to allocate so much to that from these funds? Or is it simply a question of we want the increase to go from 30 to 60? Meaning more money from...
I think generally this is just kind of like we were just talking about, this is a level of school funding question.
Okay.
And obviously, the revenue limit as it stands now was built on a set of numbers that go back to the 90s. But I think what is a little different with this one is this area of services, the demand for that is increasing.
Sure.
You get into that inflationary talk, conversation we were just having, the inflation in this one is being driven by a greater demand for those services for our students. So, but overall, all these come back to funding, right? A level of funding.
And I guess more generally to maybe state my question better, all the money that we have within the district right now that we can allocate to these is being allocated, correct? So it's not like tied up in a fund that we can't use. It's being spent to the best of our ability.
Yeah, ultimately, they fund us at a level. The transfer from Fund 10 that Dr. Siebert was just speaking about, the board can set that at 20 million, 10 million, 30 million. Now, there's a impact of making those decisions. But we can assign dollars to this, but we're giving something up on the Fund 10 side of the ledger.
Okay.
And the number's 20.4 million in the current budget is the transfer.
Okay.
It has been 19, but it went up last year, or current year.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. All right, number 4 is on advanced learning. So it's amending a current resolution and encouraging schools to focus less on identifying gifted students and more on identifying and addressing unmet learning needs of students capable of high levels of achievement. And within this resolution as well, it further encourages districts to provide a variety of advanced programming opportunities for K-12 students, including acceleration options, and to offer opportunities to individuals that students from every background are able to achieve at their highest possible levels. So it's kind of in the gifted and talented ballpark, but trying to encourage districts to provide various different acceleration options, which for the most part we try to do and I think is something that we would support from our perspective.
Any questions or comments?
Okay, let's move on to number 5. Number 5 is broadening staff expenditures eligible for state categorical aid for school mental health services. So what this looks to do is to broaden just beyond school social workers who can be reimbursed, we can receive reimbursement for, to also include school counselors and school psychologists in that reimbursement category as well. So it would encourage the DPI to expand the license categories eligible to qualify for that funding for mental health programming. Mr. Clark, anything that I'm missing there?
No, it pretty much goes, it's the same conversation as we just had at number 3. It's the level of funding. The one thing, I guess it'd be a net zero, but make it more confusing to expand this without expanding the pool of money that they're funding it with. It's just going to lower the percentage. Because the denominator will get larger. If we add more costs in there, but the pool of money stays at $12 million or whatever it is, it's still $12 million being dispersed. My guess is they're looking for this expansion and for us to hold at the 30 or 60% or whatever it ends up being. So it's a level of funding for an area where we have increased demand.
Okay.
All right, questions?
Yeah, question on this. Because of the greater demand for these services, is part of our issue, we simply don't have the people to hire to fill these positions? Or, I mean, perhaps here in the district, they're well-staffed right now. But this is looking to get more funding to have more people in place to do this, which is needed. I guess the question I have is, if we need more people to fill these positions, how do we get them? And maybe that's not for this current committee to discuss, but having the funding is great, but finding the people to do this, is that part of this concern? It looks like they're broadening the pool for who's eligible to actually fill these positions. So I don't know if that's watered down or not, but there's only so many people that are in this field. How do we attract those people to school districts in general and to ours if we need bodies to fill these positions?
I guess I think there probably is in terms of adding people to these positions, this certainly would help because you have increased funding to fund the positions.
Sure.
My read on this is they want a higher level of reimbursement for positions that are currently here to increase overall funding. And maybe in our budget situation, keep positions you currently have, not so much speak of adding positions to that. But that's my guess on what they're after. Again, to me, the bigger thing is, okay, let's add these positions to the aidable roster of license, but if the pool of money doesn't change, we're now down to 20% rather than 30%, and we're
Sure.
still getting roughly the same dollar amount. But any increase in funding helps us either retain existing positions or staff and potentially recruit new staff, depending on how we want to allocate those resources.
Okay.
Good questions, Mr. Zenobia. Number 6 is similar, broadening, I believe, we're on 6, right? Yeah, they're very similar. Broadening the scope of mental health services eligible for reimbursement. So here, this one looks to broaden the scope of mental health professionals eligible for reimbursement to include licensed mental health social workers, licensed mental health psychologists, licensed mental health counselors, and community mental health coordinators. So I think it's very similar to the one that we just discussed.
I think the only difference, now, ask me who I'm talking to and I'll tell you the answer, but for smaller districts who maybe can't secure specialty services like psychologists or social workers, and they contract out, maybe this is more helpful to them. For us, the one concern I would have, and what's different, is you're moving this to an outside group, cost structure, cost increases. Where now, with our own staff, the board controls that via the compensation packages. Again, I don't know if that's a bad thing. I think maybe we're, for an area that maybe it's hard to find staff, maybe broadening this to these areas ends up being a good thing. I just worry about, we're no longer in charge of their cost structure. They're their own entity, they're private. Again, I think overall, if you're interested in increased funding for these types of services. These three items kind of roll into one package of options that, that we could consider.
Okay.
Okay. Number 7 is curriculum and professional training on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. So this one is encouraging public schools to develop educational curriculum and professional training to teach the history, culture, and contributions of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders to the economic, cultural, and social development of Wisconsin and to the United States. And it would require that the legislature provide funding, or ask at least, to develop this curriculum and training. It talks about in the background here that these populations are growing significantly in Wisconsin, and talks also about the increase in anti-Asian hate and harassment during COVID across the country as a rationale behind this request. And the resolution overall aims to build greater understanding of these populations, which may in turn reduce violence or threats of violence against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Oh, questions or thoughts on that one?
Okay.
Okay, very good. Number 8, 9, 8. These are all going to be relatively similar, and there's another sheet that I put on at your places that starts with, it looks like this. It says government relations. So these are these last 3 are essentially language cleanup, and they come out of this particular larger book that comes out in June that was mentioned in the video. So number 8 talks about, and I think I flipped it here, excuse me. This is the WASB national presence and/or National Association membership. I think you'll recall a couple weeks ago in one of the updates, I had sent you a FAQ about the WASB removing itself from the Nsba, which is the National School Board Association. And so this has been put forward, these next 3 are put forward by the WASB Board of Directors to modify existing resolutions. In this particular case, it's 5.16, which is on the first page of that additional handout, and it's entitled Nsba membership. So what it would be looking to do is remove National School Board Association, or Nsba specifically, and replace it with a national presence or membership in national associations. So it provides some flexibility that would ultimately reside with the WASB Board of Directors to determine the nature of their national presence and or membership, and not tie them specifically to the Nsba or National School Board Association. So very similar to what we often do in Policy Committee, where we're just cleaning up some language and maybe removing, in this case, a specific reference and allowing them to have more flexibility on their national presence. Question on that?
Yeah, I guess maybe more of a comment. I think it's, in a lot of states have done this, I think it's great that the WASB is no longer going to maintain a relationship with the NASB, or Nsba rather. And that goes toward what they had done earlier the year in asking the federal government to tamp down free speech of school boards and of parents coming to school boards. And the backlash from that is what I understand all of these policies to be doing. The point being, they're going to have to go back and find another national group to represent them. So I think this is a step in the right direction on all 3 of these. I know it's cleaning up some of their language, but from what I understand them doing, I think they're moving in the right direction on these 3 things. What ends up being the national group that they tie onto, I think, is unclear if that group exists now or
Right.
whether it needs to be formed, but I think this is a good move. So.
Yes.
I believe this would be for Dr. Siebert. Am I correct in my understanding that the School District of Waukesha, we weren't affiliated with the National Association for quite some time prior to all of this occurring?
Correct. I think the last time we were associated was in 2011.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's been a decade at least.
Yes.
Just so that folks are aware.
Right. No, thank you for the question,
Yes,
Ms. Roddy. Okay, let's try to check. We'll move on to, we can maybe do 9 and 10 together because, to Mr. Zenobia's point, they are all similar. So this one, again, is on impact aid. It's going into the second page of the handout that I had for you with Resolution 2.63 on impact aid. And its language clarity, once again, as Resolution 2.63 specifically calls out the National School Board Association, or Nsba. And this would, again, give the WASB Board of Directors that ability to determine, to Mr. Zenobia's point, who they want to associate with at the national level or how their national presence appears or looks. And then number 10 is also in the same vein. It's the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESEA, which is the original No Child Left Behind, just renamed. And this is, again, language clarity since within that one, which is Resolution 3.17, which is on the last page of that additional handout. It, again, talks specifically about the National School Board Association and would be giving the Board of Directors that flexibility, again, with national connections. So any
Okay.
questions on that one? There's 2.
Oh, thank
Okay.
you.
No, thank you. So, Mr. Zenobia, you feel confident and good? I know you do.
I
Good questions and,
Yeah,
yes,
learned a lot
that's good.
here in the last few days.
Yes, yeah, it's an interesting process, but thank you for being our delegate. Very much appreciated.
Thank
Yes,
you.
thank you. Okay, then moving on to our January legislative visit and touring opportunity.
All right, so thank you, Ms. Reinacek. So, building on our discussion from last time we met in September, at that meeting, you'll remember, we talked about our summer and fall legislative connections. And one of the things that we had talked with all of those individuals about was some type of day in the district coming up in January, we had hoped. And we had some great discussion in September at our committee meeting about what that could look like. So I took the liberty of putting together a template for you to consider, and it was included in your packet, and we kind of just walk through it, and then I would really welcome your ideas, because it certainly is not set in stone. We could flex it and modify it however you'd like. But what we were thinking is, and this a lot is based on our conversation from September, we'd pick a day in late January. The date I picked so far was Wednesday, January 29th. We talked about having flexibility where people could come for one session or multiple sessions. And so we set a time frame of 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. with a lunch included at the back end from noon to 1. And what the design of the day could look like would be 45-minute tour opportunities throughout the districts with slots available at 9, 10, and 11. And then, like I said, we'd follow that with a lunch and debrief, as well as a relationship building session from noon to 1 here at Lindholm. And the tour options that we've picked so far to highlight the district is we thought we could have people interested see AVID either at Les Paul, so a middle school version, or at North High School. We could have people see our STEM schools, either the elementary version at Randall or the middle school version at Saratoga. We thought we could highlight the health professions and engineering academies at South High School. Thought we could highlight dual language at Banting so they could get a feel of what that looks like and why that's something that's very special here in Waukesha. We also thought seeing an arts integration school at Summit View, that's unique to us, and that would be neat for them to see. And then we also thought our MAID program, Manufacturing, Automotive Design, Engineering, and Tech Ed at West High School would be another opportunity to really see the work that we do around with local businesses as well as that school to career pipeline that we're trying to design. And so what we would do is, and we could add to that, we could subtract from that, I could have leaders of the district in those areas, for example, AVID. We could have an Amanda Wagner and Yasmin at each of those sites to be there to welcome people along with the principal and then show them around and show them various aspects of those programs during the time that they were there, and we could do that for each of the areas. It could be the principal, could be other people that would, like dual language, it certainly could be at Banting, could certainly be Mrs. Garcia Velez, but also potentially like D. Garcia, so we could make sure that people really got a insight view of what those programs offer. And so we could offer them, I think, at each of those time zones, so people could be flexible. So it wouldn't have to be like, well, I really wanted to do STEM Randall, but it's at the same time as the South Health Academy profession. We could offer all of them in all 3 slots so that people could be really flexible. We could get this out very, very quickly here before the holidays with a sign-up sheet. And people could come to any or all of the opportunities throughout the morning, or they could just come to the lunch. And so that's kind of how I was thinking about it, but I'd welcome your feedback on what you think of that, or if you think it could look a little bit different.
I think all of this is wonderful, but just starting with the date, I think the 29th is a Saturday, so maybe that's a typo.
Oh, is it? Maybe it is. Let's look. Oh, yeah.
Do you think it's the 19th? Do you
I think
think?
it's the 26th. Yes.
Okay,
Because the 19th would be the WASB convention.
okay.
Oh, yes. Good catch, Ms. Ryanchek. So it'd be Wednesday, January 26th.
December is the 29th is a Wednesday.
Oh, maybe that's what I looked at. Yes. You ever do that when you're going through the calendar and then all of a sudden you're in the wrong year?
Yes.
Or, yeah, that's maybe what I did, right? I just didn't go down far enough and I was still in December. Okay, so yes, Wednesday, January 26th. Thank you for catching that. Ms.
Sure.
Ryanchek. Any other feedback on the design or the process or things that you'd like to highlight?
No, I think it looks excellent. Anything from you, Mr. Zenobia?
Yes, do we have a feel at all of how many legislators and others, staff that have an interest in coming? Have we talked to them a little bit when they've come in for meetings? Do we?
Yes, we have. So in each of those meetings, we tried to kind of highlight that we wanted to do something like this. They all seem to have interest in doing it. I think it'll just come down to the calendaring and
Sure.
does it work for them?
The second point would be the tour options, and I think these are all great. One observation would be perhaps to do some of these things on a time basis of, from 9 to 10, there's the opportunity to tour the first 2, logistically, it might get hard to have all these people in all these different places and then have them come back to a central location for lunch. And again, you had mentioned some of the people obviously on site that will be there, but is there a plan to have administration go with, obviously? I mean, I know you can't be in 6 different places, but what does that look logistically like? And
Sure. Yeah, so I had a number of different thoughts similar to your question, like would we just chunk them and then, like even committee members and I could be at those sites and along with, like, for example, Avid, Amanda Wagner and the principal, Mr. Bennett at Les Paul. But then I didn't want to also limit, like, when they could, like, let's say they really wanted to see Avid, but they couldn't come at 9.
Right.
Which is why I thought if we offered all of them all morning, while we all couldn't be at all of the sites, I could have our directors that oversee those areas, as well as principals, as well as our coordinators that oversee some of these areas, like, for example, Molly, that oversees tech ed and those types of programs. She could be at West all morning to make sure that these people learned all about all the partnerships along with Mr. Pat or whoever else. So that was the thought. Like, we could probably have enough administrative support in all of these areas that if members of the committee or Mr. Clark or I wanted to kind of bop around, we could do that too. But I think your question is good too from the standpoint of if we kept them all together, we could ensure that they knew exactly where they were going. They knew exactly when to come down here for the lunch. So there's some value in that thinking too. So I'd be open to flexing the way we think about it.
Okay.
My only thought is it's such a great opportunity and a great chance to see everything. If there's only 10 people that would come, like, have we thought of extending it to like realtors or anyone that would want to see this and then be able to tell our story even more? How can we just expand it a little more?
I like that. Yeah. It's a good idea, Ms. Ranichek.
I mean, if someone's going to be at that building for people to be able to come through and answer all their questions, it'd be nice to just maximize it as much as we can.
Mm-hmm. We could certainly expand the guest list.
Okay.
Yes. Anybody besides realtors that you're thinking? So we'd have local elected officials, staffers from the federal elected officials that we've met with. We can do realtors. We could do.
The Waukesha Business Association.
Yeah, I would say open it right up to just all businesses and community organizations, probably that are already familiar with the school district that, we can get out. Obviously, we're not going to advertise this too much, but the people we can email and that are already affiliated with the school,
Sure.
it's a great idea to
Mm-hmm.
get as many bodies through.
Right. Great idea. Okay. All right. Anything else you want to talk about on that? Otherwise, we'll take the ball and we'll kind of get rolling. We'll figure out once we start to map this out, to your question, Mr. Zenobia, what makes the most sense. If it makes sense to kind of keep it open all the time, or if it makes sense to chunk it a little bit differently.
Well, and to Ms. Ranichek's point, if we did have more people, and then this becomes a little bit easier to say, yeah, let's do all 6, and
Sure.
just say, show up between these hours. And, I mean, I'd be happy to take point on one of these as well, just to have a presence somewhere and,
Mhm. Yeah.
so.
And kind of like the convention, it'll say, are you interested in these breakout sessions? Or what does it have, like some tours? Because people are not just coming 20 minutes like us. Sometimes people are coming 5 hours, and they'll come to they'll stay at the hotel and such, and they'll bring their spouse. And so they'll have excursions. And you check off those so that people know what those numbers are. So maybe when we do say an RSVP, let us know what you're interested in, like top 3, then we can see, okay, we're going to have a lot of people at STEM or whatever, or the MAID. Then we just know where to place people. We just kind of get a count. So
Okay.
maybe just have that as part of the RSVP.
Sounds good. Well, thank you all for your suggestions.
Okay, then any other, so moving on to other business, any recommendations for future committee meetings? No? I just had a question, kind of when we were going through those resolutions. I know that I was writing some notes down. I know that we get counted poorly, or our overall report card gets docked when we allow students to stay until the age of 21 when they do have special needs. And we are giving extra education for life and job skills, and yet we're punished for this option. I know that it affects our graduation percentages. Is that a Wasb thing, or can we talk to our legislators about that? Another one would be our schools with the academies, let's just say our South with the health and engineering academies. Those report cards are affected and reflecting lower grades when those academies who are the top ACT numbers in the state are taken out. So it's like if you're going to take those out, then that's not really left with an accurate number of the kids at South. So the South scores go down. And so just those two things when we're speaking of or talking to people where we are kind of hit in a negative light because of the way things are structured and looked at a state level, who do we talk to? Is that Wasb, or is that these legislators that come in and say, how can we do differently with the DPI?
That's a great question. We could certainly put that on our next agenda, because I think it could be both. I think we could, by September of next year, write resolutions on topics such as that, and I think we could also have conversations with our local elected officials on those topics.
Okay, and if you see anything that I haven't heard of that just don't seem fair, let us know. Okay, well, thank you. Our next meeting, oh, now my papers are all shifted, sorry. Do we have a meeting planned? It's usually every other month, so probably February, and then we could maybe recap what happened in January?
I think that's a great idea.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, well, then this meeting is adjourned. Thank you all for coming.